So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the final session of the day. That sounds really loud there. In this session, we're going to take a look at some new services that are coming online for the Windows Azure platform. SQL Azure Data Sync and SQL Azure Reporting. My name's Mark Scurrell. I'm a lead programmer at Microsoft in Redmond. And it's my team that specifically owns SQL Azure Data Sync, and they're back there at the moment working hard on the next version of that. I've got our sister teams in SQL Azure producing reporting, Windows Azure Data Market, as well as some other things, and some SQL Azure database services as well. So the agenda for today, what I wanted to do was start off with a brief overview on the Windows Azure platform, just to ensure we all get level set and are on the same page in terms of some of the cloud terminology. I'll then go into data sync and reporting, do a deeper dive. I've got some slides and got plenty of demos as well, so you don't have to listen to me all the time. And then we'll wrap up with a roadmap, tell you what's coming online and when. So what I thought I would do, although I'm not sure whether I'm going to see anything, is sort of get a quick idea of where you guys are on sort of the cloud and how far you've got and how much you know on this area. So maybe I'll cover my eyes a little, but I'm sort of interested in how many of you in the audience have actually deployed Windows Azure applications that perhaps use SQL Azure as the store. Can you raise your hands? Anyone? Okay, so we've got a few. How many of you have actually dipped your toes a little, used the SDK, got a free trial offer, and tried out Windows Azure and SQL Azure? You put your hands up, a few more, hopefully. A few more. And then has anyone, maybe grasping a little here, anyone actually tried SQL Azure Data Sync, the CTP or the reporting CTP? Anyone? No. Okay. So that's good. I'll keep it at a fairly high level, go at a reasonable pace. So I wanted to start off with some terminology around cloud services and the various levels of offerings that we have for our cloud services. Because everyone talks about the cloud, and everyone has their own different interpretation or different understanding of the capabilities that are provided. And what we've really done is sort of split things up into sort of three main categories of service. First of all, there's infrastructure as service. This is where, we provide the value of having machines off in the cloud, running in our huge data centers, so avoids you having to buy the machines, make it easier for you to scale, but what you do is really upload your VMs or use those. So basically you're using the same service on the same software, but utilizing someone else's hardware. And there's a bunch of advantages for doing that. But the next level up is platform as a service. And that's where we really want to make things easier for you, provide more out of the box for you. And I think SQL Azure itself is a great example of that. If you compare SQL Azure with SQL Server, for example, running in a VM. With SQL Azure, you don't have to worry about installing, upgrading. You don't have to worry about log backups. You don't have to worry about availability. All these capabilities and more are provided to you as a platform, a higher level value, or platform as a service. And then right at the top, we have software as a service. Software particularly used by end users, and that was going to utilize either platform as a service or the infrastructure as a service. So the Windows Azure platform really comes in here as providing both infrastructure and platform as a service. And then hopefully you guys, customers, partners, are going to use that platform and build your own applications, including software as a service. And then things like Office 365, are great examples of Microsoft-provided software as a service. So the Windows Azure platform as a whole consists of a number of capabilities and an expanding list of capabilities. For Windows Azure itself, you've got the compute capabilities, you've got various storage capabilities with tables, blobs, and so on. You've got a management experience, the content caching, queuing, data marketplace, and so on. Numerous capabilities there. And then for SQL Azure, we've got the database reporting and data sync. And then the idea for the platform is to give you as much flexibility as possible on how to use that. You can use Visual Studio or other development tools. You can use C#, VB, or Python, Ruby, Java. It's your choice. And then on the database world, PHP to connect to SQL Azure. So really provide a great amount of flexibility and choice on how you can utilize the Windows Azure platform. So obviously in this talk, we're going to look at SQL Azure and the SQL Azure family of services. So the relational database, believe it or not, has been out probably almost a year and a half now, running in production. And then later on this year, we're going to have reporting and data sync that we'll look at now. So the first thing I want to say on data sync is really emphasize that it is a cloud service, and it's a service that we're building, but it runs on top of the Windows Azure platform. We use exactly the same APIs and so on to actually host our service on top of Windows Azure. And there's really, for V1, two main scenarios that we're focusing on. And the first, and probably the most popular at the moment, and probably, not surprising given the current state and the transition in the market, is that of linking the on-premises world with the cloud world and sharing data between your on-premises database, SQL Server, and your cloud-based database, SQL Azure. So allowing applications to be built and running in both locations, but they need to operate over the same data. There's an extension to the on-premises to cloud scenario, and that's when you have multiple on-premises. So branch offices or retail offices, I think, are pretty good examples. So in this case, again, each of these locations could be sharing data with a cloud database, maybe an aggregation scenario. They collect data and aggregate that data in the cloud. But another interesting use is actually not to make even use of that data that's sitting in the cloud, maybe in the SQL Azure database, but using the cloud as a data hub and always available, easy to access hub to facilitate the communication between the various locations. And that's something we've seen some customers wanting to use data sync for. Once data is in the cloud, or you're writing a new application with data stored in SQL Azure, there are many cases where you want multiple copies of that data. Now, with the Windows Azure platform, we have data centers scattered around the world, multiple data centers, and you might want multiple copies within the same data center, but also you might want those copies spread around the world. So, for example, to provide the best user experience for users around the world, people often want to locate their Windows Azure applications and the data that accesses in SQL Azure in the various data centers or regions around the world. And they want to share the data between those regions. And then perhaps even linking these together and sharing the data around the world, but then also between a head office, an HQ, and running on-premises SQL Server. Now, I wanted to take just a little diversion here because the question of import-export and the relationship to sync often comes up when I talk to users. And I really wanted to differentiate the import-export cases and the tools that you use for import-export from the synchronization and the cases when you wouldn't want to use synchronization. And really, when I think about import-export, it's pretty much a one-off, a one-time operation. Maybe you're moving your application from on-premises to the cloud. You get your SQL Server database, and you want to make that data available in the cloud. Perhaps you're allowed some downtime, and you can do that overnight or over a weekend. But it's a one-time import of data, export from, say, SQL Server, and import into SQL Azure. And, there's a ton of tools you can use to do that, all ranging from BCP, that low-level, high-performance transfer of just the raw data, all the way down through to SSIS, and then also DAX and DAC logical import-export. DAX, the data tier applications, and actually we've just released a preview of DAC import-export, which is the way to get a DAC together with the data exported and imported. So that's actually available on SQL Azure Labs, if you're interested. So contrast that import and export, which is one-off, with an ongoing relationship between the databases and these locations. And in this case, there really is a longer-term relationship, and other than the initial data transfer, after that initial time, there's only deltas being transferred. And for that, we've got SQL Azure Data Sync as a service. And then if you want more control over that, we have the Microsoft Sync Framework if you literally want to embed synchronization into your applications. So hopefully that separates the two scenarios and gives you some guidance on what to use when. So let's dig into a little various use cases, various customers we've worked with that want to use and sync data between on-premises and the cloud. And a lot of these cases are very, very simple. You've literally got some data sitting in SQL Server on-premises, and you want to make that available on an ongoing basis to the cloud in SQL Azure, and maybe you've got a website or a no-data feed to expose that data publicly. In other cases, I've actually got an application that I can update in the cloud, and then that data can flow both ways, or could flow one way down or both ways. Then, related to the branch office or retail office scenarios, there's using the cloud to aggregate data, provide a global view over all your data, or to share data between the locations via that cloud hub. And then finally, this is pretty common when people have data, again, sitting on premises, they have their applications, but they really want to fan that out around the world. Again, more of a publishing scenario where they're going to make that data available around the world. They want it close to their users, so they're going to take that and configure data sync and fan the data out to a number of data centers around the world. Within the cloud, really, there's a couple of cases or common cases where you want multiple copies of the data. One of which is related to what we'll talk about later, is reporting. Perhaps you want to utilize the cloud as being always available and easy for your customers to access, and you want to give them access to a whole lot of reports. So you're going to expect a pretty heavy reporting workload, and you want to offload that from your main OLTP cloud database. So you could use data sync to facilitate that and have 1, 2, or more copies of the data that could be indexed differently as well. You could index them so that the performance is really good for the queries that the reporting services is issuing. Then there's read-write scenarios, and I've seen multiple instances of people really wanting to leverage these data centers around the world, locate their applications around the world, but want to share the data between them. And with data sync, the service doesn't care whether that's in the same data center, the multiple copies in one data center, or around the world in our different data centers. So that's it on the slides for a moment. Let's have a look at SQL Azure Data Sync in action. So being all about SQL Azure and databases, I'm actually going to start in Management Studio and let you know what our starting point is for this demo. So the first thing I want to highlight is I've got multiple database servers opened here in Management Studio, the first one of which is a local one. So I've got SQL Server 2008 R2 running on my machine here with a couple of databases, and of course using AdventureWorks LT just as an example. If I drill into AdventureWorks, we can see I've got the tables and I've got the data there for the customer table. But I've got another database here locally. It has the same schema. I've basically used the same deployment scripts on all these databases, but it doesn't have the data yet. I select the data from there, there isn't any. So that's my on-premises SQL Server with two databases. Now here, I've got a SQL Azure server with a database configured. And I name the database to make it clear that this is a server I've provisioned over in one of the US data centers. So this sort of highlights one of the things about SQL Azure and the values of SQL Azure is that you can use a lot of the same tools and experiences and skills you already have. So here's SQL Azure database in Management Studio, pretty much like the on-premises SQL Server, same experience. So I've got AdventureWorks US1 here, same schema. I use the same script. I use the same script for SQL Server and SQL Azure. And I can issue a query against that, and the zero rows return there. So, and then finally, I've got another SQL Azure server here with a couple of databases, and this is a server based in one of the European data centers. And exactly the same here, same schema. I can query it. And no rows, not very exciting. So what my goal to start with here is I've got my data sitting on my on-premises database, and I want to push it out and share it, make it available with these other databases. We'll then, after that, once it's initially available, we'll make some changes and see how that works. So SQL Azure Data Sync, it's a service, and therefore based on Windows Azure, so running in a web role for CDP2, we have this fairly simple, fairly basic HTML-based UI. And let me start off by describing a couple of the pages here before we actually set up the sync. So first of all, there's this tab called Agents. So you may be wondering, how does a cloud service, something sitting in one of the Microsoft data centers, connect down to my SQL Server database? So what we ask you to do here is to download, and I'll zoom in, what we call an agent, a client agent. So it's a very lightweight Windows service that needs to sit on a machine in your offices. And on one side, it needs access to SQL Server, just be able to connect to SQL Server. And then on the other side, it's going to talk HTTPS out to our service. So I've got that running on my machine here, and I say it's just a very light Windows service with a very small amount of UI associated with it. We really want to keep that as light as possible because pretty much all your administration and so on is going to be done from the website. The next step, which I've already done, is to register the databases that I want to participate. I specifically have to register both my on-premises databases, which happens with the agent automatically here, but then I've registered, a database on the US SQL Azure and the European SQL Azure server. So that's a little bit of the background. Let's configure and bring all these databases up to date. So it all revolves around a concept called a sync group. And a sync group has a number of databases that are the members. And it's just as simple as, the members of the sync group are kept in sync. So you can have multiple sync groups and you just give it a name. So we'll just demo that. And then the first database I'm going to select here is my on-premises SQL server. That's the database on my laptop here. And then to start with, I'm just going to sync to the one SQL Azure database, and that's one in the US, so LTUS1 here. So I'm creating a sync group with 2 members to start with. So on the next page, I can see those 2 members. And then what the service has done is actually uploaded and queried those databases to determine what tables are available to sync. So we can see those listed here. And I can select all of them. But what I'm just going to do, so it runs reasonably quickly here, is just select the top 3. And the last thing I can do for a sync group is set a schedule. Or really, it's just more of an interval. How up to date do I want these databases, or how close together do they need to be? And you can set an interval from anywhere from 2 days to down to 5 minutes. So 5 minutes is our current thinking on the smallest interval that we'll allow, and we'll see what the customer feedback is on that. So I'm not going to set this schedule for the moment, because just for the purposes of the demo, I'll just do interactive synchronizations. And that's pretty much it. I've created my sync group. We can see it listed here. And I can sync now. So that's now jumped us to the logs page. And this is the page that sort of tells us what's happening and what has happened. So I did some previous practice stuff here before the session. But what we can see here is it's being executed, a couple of provision tasks, and then a sync task. So what the provision is doing is it's really preparing these databases for synchronization, and so that they can support delta sync, and the sync just of what has changed. So we need to create some metadata tables on both sides to prepare those databases. And then once that's there, it's actually going to perform the sync. So it's actually gone and done that. The sync's done, completed. And I can click here. There we go. So I clicked on View Log. I get it's refreshed. So down at the bottom here, we can see, let me zoom in a little. We can see the number of rows that have actually been uploaded here. So overall, the amount of data uploaded was just under 1,700 rows, and that's been uploaded. For download, obviously, there's nothing. That database was blank. So if I go back to Management Studio here, and let me look at, let me guess, maybe this guy. Is that US? That's US1. Execute that. So now we've got our data. So we've taken the data from my on-premises SQL server, and it's now in a SQL Azure database in a US data center. So that's a one-time upgrade. Let me just highlight the fact that we do the Delta sync. So I'm going to update the customer. And I'm going to change, let me see. I'm going to change Mr. Orlando here to Mr. Miami. Customer ID is 1. Execute that. So we can see that's gone through. Select that. So Mr. Orlando is now Mr. Miami. We'll go back to SQL Azure Data Sync. Go back to the group, hit sync now. So this time, obviously the databases have already been prepared. Those metadata tables already exist, so it only has to perform the synchronization, and it should be pretty quick because it's only doing the deltas. So let me even refresh this and view the log, and we can see here that we've just had the one row downloaded from the cloud down to my on-premises SQL Server. So that's the basics there. Let's extend it out because I actually had multiple databases. So I can go into this sync group, hit the edit, and then add more databases. So I can add the second on-premises database that I had. Add that. And then I've got my database in one of the European data centers here, and add that. And save. And sync now. So it's jumped us to the logs page again. And then because I've introduced 2 new databases that hadn't yet participated in the sync, then it's got to provision those, create the tables. So it'll do that, and then it'll perform the sync. And then those 1,700 or so rows should be downloaded or transferred to those different databases, one on-premise and one in the European data center. So most of that actually has completed already. But let me show you what actually gets created. So here I had I've got the European database, and I've got the list of tables that was there originally. If I F5 that, so what we can see here is a number of data sync tables. We've placed them in a data sync schema, and there's 3 overall tables for metadata, and then there's tables for tracking the changes. So these track the fact that changes happened, but you don't have to worry. They're not capturing every single change and this growing and growing and growing. But there is a change tracking table created for every table that you're synchronizing. So let me have a look at some of our other queries here. I think this was the Europe. Yep. Execute that. So now we've got the data there. And this was my second local, and we've got the data there. So now, we've seen, I think we've pretty much been through all the scenarios of sharing data with the cloud, sharing it between on-premises locations, and between cloud locations. So back to the deck. So I thought it might be interesting to tell you a little bit about what's behind the scenes. And I mentioned earlier, we've built this on top of Windows Azure, just like any application you would build on top of Windows Azure. So we've actually built our cloud application, and we've had, for this sync service, we've had the advantage and leveraged something called the Microsoft Sync Framework. So this is the developer framework I mentioned earlier that can perform synchronization between databases as well as other data stores. So we've really built on that work that we did previously, but built a cloud application on top of it and deployed that to Windows Azure using a mixture of web roles and worker roles and so on. So for example, the admin UI you saw was running in a web role. We also used, Windows Azure Storage, Windows Azure Blobs. So for example, if you're doing large data transfers, we actually split up the amount of data into chunks or batches and transfer those up, store them in Blob Store temporarily, and then apply them on the other side. So that has the advantage that if the connection goes down partway through the transfer, when it comes back up, we can just continue on and you don't have to start from scratch. We actually use SQL Azure, the sync groups that you saw there, that configuration, the schedule, the registered databases, and so on, those logs, all stored in SQL Azure. Then there's the actual user databases, both in the cloud and on-premise. And I showed you the change tracking and the metadata that we add to those databases. We don't actually change your existing tables. I'll reassure you, what we do is purely additional. And then finally, there's the sync agent, that small Windows service that's sitting on an on-premises server, facilitating the communication between my SQL server and the service with SQL Azure. So we talked a little bit about the provisioning. Those tables actually get populated via some very small triggers. And then there's some stored procedures that really encapsulate our T-SQL to query changes and make changes. Also on the SQL Server side, we do enable snapshot isolation so we can guarantee the consistency of the queries, while there's a whole lot of there's a whole lot of transactions happening in the background. So we can have very consistent, very reliable sync while there's a lot of activity on the database. I mentioned the batching, about how we split the data up. And then finally, I thought I'd mention, what's our transactional consistency model? Because this is something that, you should consider, and we're definitely open to feedback on. So what we actually do is we obviously need to preserve and take note of the PK-FK relationships. But one thing that we don't do is record, your transaction boundaries. It could be days between syncs and so on. And when we replay those changes, we haven't recorded when the transaction started, when they finished, and so on. Because all we transfer are the net changes, not every single change that has happened between syncs. So the best way to illustrate that is the usual order details. So if on one side you've created a new order, created an order row, and in the same transaction inserted an order details row, and that's in one transaction, there's a chance when we make those changes on one of the other databases that the order row would get inserted in one transaction and then the details in another transaction. So we haven't had too many objections to that yet, but I thought I'd mention it, and I'm definitely open to feedback on that. So some of the key features, we've seen how, I think, pretty easy and straightforward it is to configure. Definitely no code required. Easy to define, what to sync and how often. I want to stress that we do have full sync capabilities here. A lot of the time, people are simply using this for simple, maybe one-way transfer. But we definitely have a lot of customers that are updating the data in both places, even potentially the same data. And they really need the full sync capabilities to detect conflicts and the ability to resolve those conflicts. So we offer that. And then there's a lot of logging and monitoring. And then obviously, because this is our service, as opposed to something that you're having to deploy and scale out. We're scaling this out as usage grows so that everyone maintains a great experience. One of our main investments after CTP2 for V1 is a new UI, and I just wanted to give you a flavor of that. So what we're working on is fully integrating into the Windows Azure portal. And this is just a wireframe of this, where we hope to end up in terms of a nice graphical user interface. Something where you can easily see, what you've configured to sync and what the status of the overall, your sync groups is. So just give you a flavor, we're working on this probably as we speak, and this will be available in the next CTP. So along with that, one of the things that you may have noticed when we went through the experience was that I selected a subset of the tables. But often, you might want not all the columns for each table, or you might not want all the rows that are in a table to be synchronized. So for the next CTP, we're working on greatly enhanced filtering to give you that ability to select the subset of columns or to create a filter and only have a subset of rows. So for example, there was a customer, they had a fairly simple publishing scenario where they had all their data sitting in SQL Server, and they wanted to utilize the cloud to make data public. But there was only a subset of the data once it reached a certain age or had been through a certain amount of review that wanted to be made available publicly via a website and via an OData feed. So this row filtering will really help for those scenarios. We're going to provide more control over conflict resolution and more control on sync direction and being able to specify that on per member pair. Today, when I showed you the demo, I had actually pre-created the databases on all the members. We will actually work if you've just created the database. If those tables don't exist, then the service will actually go and provision and create those tables for you. And it only does go so far in CTP2, and we'll make that a little more robust going forward in CTP3. But quite honestly, I think what people will do is they really want the control on their database schema and do similar to what I did here and have their scripts or their DAC pack and deploy that themselves to each location. But the automatic provisioning just really is a good first step, makes it really easy to try out the service and get something up and running and play with it. And then another thing that comes up all the time is that of schema updates and schema changes. You can go through the experience today. People will say, great, hey, I've got this up and running, I've got these changes flowing, but now I need to upgrade my application. I need to upgrade my database. I've got a new table that I want to sync. I've got an extra column in an existing table to sync. I've changed a varchar 100 to a varchar 200. And the last thing that you want to do is to have to effectively rip all this down, reconfigure, and sync all the data from scratch. So in the final version, we'll be able to cater for certainly some of the common schema updates and potentially even sync those schema updates. And last but not least, we're looking into the billing model. And I'm sure you'll be thrilled to hear that, we won't be giving out V1 for free. We'll actually be looking to charge for these capabilities. So that's all I really wanted to cover for SQL Azure Data Sync for the moment. I'll make a little return later. But let's move on to reporting. So pretty much like some of the other services, the goal of SQL Azure reporting is to take a lot of those, great capabilities that already exist with your on-premises SQL Server and take them to the cloud for you and give you those advantages of them being in the cloud in terms of, no hardware to buy, no upgrades to do, scale out, and so on. So there's two main scenarios for SQL Azure reporting for V1. The first is that of operational reports. So you're going to be able to use, your existing tooling, BI Dev Studio, author your reports, and then instead of uploading them to your on-premises reporting services, you can upload them to SQL Azure reporting. And then SQL Azure reporting will be able to query SQL Azure databases, and then those reports can get rendered in the web browser. There's also the case of embedded reports. So you can take the report controls and embed reports actually in your applications. Maybe a Windows Azure application. So have an overall application with a reporting section where people can go to, and these reports are actually embedded in your application experience. So as I said, I think there's just a lot of the common values here with this cloud service around the scale and reliability and reduced admin, no hardware, and so on. I think something that's worth highlighting and similar to the DataSync example was really the accessibility. You've now got reporting services available in the cloud, and if you want to make reports available to the public or a set of customers, then it's very easy for you to do that, rather than deploying your own local reporting services and worrying about security and so on there. And then the other point was the symmetry. Just as with SQL Server and SQL Azure, we try our best to let you leverage your existing tools and your existing skills to leverage the new cloud service. So there's a lot of the common features that are in the boxed reporting services available in SQL Azure reporting. So author your reports with Dev Studio, pull data from the database, in this case SQL Azure. You've got all the same rich charts and maps and so on there. The ability to render into different formats and so on. I think the one at the end there is interesting, is the SOAP APIs, and that there's a bunch of APIs that you can get to, so you can query what reports have I up there, what folders, and almost like provide your own report manager experience that you can embed in an application, as well as embedding individual reports too. And like other V1s, though, there will be some features and capabilities that aren't in the first version of SQL Azure reporting. You can go through that list there. I think just the one thing I would point out, though, is, comparatively speaking, compared to a box product, because we're providing this as a service, we will be updating our service much more frequently than, a box product, or we could with a box product. So it's not, 1, 2, 3 years even between updates and some of these features becoming unavailable. It's a matter of months normally. I know with SQL Azure, we've pretty much rolled out a service update every 3 or 4 months since it was released about 1.5 years ago. And that's, there's one of the great advantages of this cloud platform. So let's take a look at what you can do with SQL Azure reporting. So actually, I'm going to start off here in BI Dev Studio. I've reused my AdventureWorks database, and I put together just a very simple report here in BI Dev Studio that it's going to expose some of the customer data in those tables that we saw earlier. So the first thing we need to notice is, this is just the regular BI Dev Studio experience. Some of the differences will come in when we look at sort of specific configuration items. So the one to start with here is the shared data sources, and if I open that, we can see here that instead of pointing at a local SQL server, just like as in Management Studio, I can simply point the connection string at a SQL Azure database. So this is pointing at the US database here. So that shared data source is used by this data source over here. I can just show that. So that's used there, reference there. And I've got one simple query. Just very simply pulls in the customer info and address info to return city, state, and country for each customer. So I've got that there, and then I've got, a pie chart and a simple table here. So if I preview this then, and I can just hit report, the network here is very good. So that has preview, I can preview the report, and this has sucked in the data, has queried this data from the SQL Azure database over in the US data center. And we've got the pie chart and then a simple table showing the breakdown of states or provinces per country. So I can develop my reports in exactly the same way. I can develop them against a local SQL Server or SQL Express database, or I can point them directly at the SQL Azure database. So next up would be to deploy this. So I can deploy it in basically the same way. If I pull up the properties here, what you can see is, again, instead of the local server name, I've got an HTTP reference out to the reporting services instance that's been provisioned for me. So that's there as the server URL, and then I'm pushing this to a folder, my folder there, up there. So let's push this out. Let's just so that we can see it really is the latest and greatest. I'll just update the time here. Or is it 6:33? Almost dinner time. Make sure that previews. It does. And then I'll just go to the report and deploy. Now this might have cached my credentials. I used it earlier on, but if it hasn't got the credentials, it'll prompt me for the server name and my account on reporting on SQL Azure reporting. So it looks like that's gone through. Let's go into the browser. And this hasn't, so I need my rather unfriendly username here. There we go. So, and then I placed my report in my folder I created for myself here. Here's the report. I just click on it. And then now that should render here, pretty much like an on-premises report accessed via Report Manager. And there we go. So we can see the report rendered here, and this is the one I literally just deployed. So this shows the BI Dev Studio experience, getting a report up into the cloud, into SQL Azure reporting. Let's just quickly look at how we can embed this in an application. So let me bring up Dev 10 here. And I've got a very, very simple Windows Azure ASP.NET application here. Simply default ASP.x, some text just saying there's a report viewer here. And then, the main component is this report viewer component. So we can see report viewer 1 here. And if I go into the code behind this, in the page init, this is where I configure that control. So I can set the URL. It's the my actual SQL Azure reporting instance. I need to set the path to the report, and then I've got my credentials here. So that's pretty much it. I've got that embedded. Let me hit run. So this will take a little longer. So this is a Windows Azure running in my local Windows Azure environment. It'll use just the local fabric and a local web server. So this is actually just based off a sample that's available, I think, on MSDN for SQL Azure reporting. And here we go. So we can see our text here in the ASP, and then the report actually rendered here pretty much in exactly the same way as we got directly from the web experience. And it's pulling the same report. And I can refresh that, I can print, I can export to the various formats and so on there. So we've seen both, well, we've seen the authoring, the rendering in reporting itself, and then the embedding of reports inside an application. And actually, this sample that's available on MSDN, this also provides like a quick and simple experience over the SOAP APIs I was talking about. So they're listed here. I won't go into those yet. So actually, I thought it would be useful now to actually show data sync and reporting working together. So let's say, for example, and I referenced an example of this pretty earlier on. I want a reporting experience in the cloud, but my data is sourced on premises. So I'm going to come back to Management Studio here, close this up. Come back to this is my local server, AdventureWorks LT1. And I'm going to use address. So I was thinking of just quick ways to impact the report. So what I thought I would do would be I'm going to make Washington State part of Canada and see how that impacts the report. So I'm going to set the country region to Canada, but where the state province equals Washington, and make sure I'm in the right context here. So I've got 51. I've basically just moved Washington State into Canada. So that's my on-premises SQL server. If I go back here and then even refresh it, this should still be the same. It's got 254 customers in the US. There we go. So what I want to do now is go back to data sync. I can see the group and say sync now. So this should take, again, it's going to do a delta sync. It should take those 51 rows, take them up to the SQL Azure databases, and then we should be able to refresh the reports and see that take effect. Looks like that's gone through. I'm going to hit refresh. So we should see 254. There we go. So my Washington customers are now part of Canada. So I really wanted to sort of link those together because the scenarios, they can live in isolation, but there's definite cases where you may want to use these together. You might be reporting up in the cloud, but have that data and make those changes still in your on-premises or via on-premises applications, and then you can use data sync to publish those. So what's coming between the current CTP and V1? Probably the major thing that you're going to see is around the user and permission management. I couldn't really go into it in great detail there, but when I logged into the website, I'm pretty much fixed. If I want to access the report, there's pretty much one set of credentials I can use to either upload the report or view the report. So we're putting a lot more capabilities in around multiple users, managing those users, and giving those users specific access to individual reports. The other major investment is going to be around performance and improving the performance. And then lastly, again, we're looking at the billing model and how best to charge for this service. So that'll be coming up for the final V1. So I just wanted to wrap up here, and I thought what might be useful is these services, they're currently in CTP, and pretty much their release roadmaps are aligned. So they're both in a limited CTP now. We've got CTP 2 for data sync and just CTP for reporting services. Those CTP programs we've actually closed them off for the moment publicly, but I've got my contact information at the end, and certainly if you want to use either of these or both of these, email me and I'll be able to get you access. But coming up after the current limited CTPs is public CTP for both the services. So the services will be available for everyone. There won't be any sign-ups. There won't be any invitation codes or so on there. So summer was what we're saying for both of these services, with then the final V1 release sometime in the fall, certainly before the end of the year. So, I wanted to give you some pointers to get at more information about Windows Azure as a whole, data sync, reporting, and even how best to give feedback on these services if you get to try them out. So I've got a bunch of URLs there. Would highlight the blog is updated all the time. If you have any problems with any of the services, then you can use the forum. That's very closely monitored. And then we actually have a very specific feature voting website. So you can go in, see what other features people have requested, and either vote on them and add to the number of people that have voted for that feature, give it more importance, or create your own feature on which other people can vote. And I think it's a great way to make your feedback heard, and we look at it a lot. And then finally there's my contact information. If you've got any questions after this that I can't address directly afterwards, or you want access to the CTP, then feel free to email me and try and get you sorted. And then we've got the final slides on trying this stuff out. So this is very important. If you'd love you to try data sync, would love you to try reporting, but if you haven't got a SQL Azure database, then here's the information that you can get, Windows Azure and SQL Azure access for free. And the information on accessing the Windows Azure information, getting the tools, and then more information about the conference, or seeing this and the other sessions online. So with that, I'm going to wrap up, and I'd love to take some questions. Thank you very much. Has anyone got any questions? You can ask now or come down afterwards. Oh, yes, one here.
You say you don't modify the table schema, but then you say you introduce triggers for the data replication or sync.
Yes.
Surely they're contradictory.
Yeah, so the question is, I made a claim that we don't alter the original tables, your user tables with your data in, and we don't. We don't add columns to those, maybe like some other technologies do. We completely create a separate set of tables for the change tracking and other metadata. But it's a perfectly fair point to say that we actually keep those tables up to date, updated via triggers. So we do add pretty much a one or two line insert trigger, update trigger, and delete trigger at the moment. So yes, we do alter it from that perspective, but we hope that doesn't, and we haven't had too much feedback yet that that's really going to impact adversely people's applications. I mean, I'd love to get more information if you think that would. Maybe one thing that we'd certainly consider for the future, for those SQL Server folks out there, there's a feature that was introduced in SQL Server 2008 called change tracking. It's not in SQL Azure yet, but what we'd like to do in a future release when it's in SQL Azure and for the on-premises databases, we would leverage that, and that would allow us to remove a lot of that. It would certainly allow us to remove the triggers and the change tracking side tables and keep that hidden from you. So that's definitely something we would like to do and move forward and hide all that stuff from you and potentially have less impact on your application. But so far, we haven't had, other than hey, look, you're creating all this stuff, we haven't specifically had customers come to us and say, hey, our application is now broken. We haven't seen that yet. Anything else? No? Okay, thanks very much again. I'll be here at the front if you want to ask me anything else. Enjoy your dinner.